welcome to a special edition of Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm Ben Max, executive editor of Gotham Gazette. In case you haven't heard, New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio announced that he is seeking an even higher office. He's running for President of the United States. After weeks of speculation, he took the plunge by first releasing a video and then heading off to Iowa and South Carolina. He joins 23 other Democrats vying for the presidential nomination on the Democratic side. So the cat's out of the bag, and what happens now? My guests with me today have lots to say. Joining me are New York Times political reporter Jeff Mays, WNYC Radio City Hall and political reporter Brigid Bergin, and political strategist L. Joy Williams. Thank you all for being here. A lot to discuss. This is kind of fun, very interesting, very important for the city and the country maybe. So first, why is the mayor doing this? Why is he jumping into the presidential race? Eljoy, what's your sense of?
Listen, why not? Everybody else is doing it, and everybody else is doing it for different reasons. Some folks are highlighting issues that they're trying to put front and center, that particularly on the Democratic progressive side are push button, hot button issues. Some are doing it for jobs. Some are doing it on the House side to sort of raise their profile so that they can run for something else later to sort of increase their fundraising base, increase attention, national attention, and go from there. So they may not have any interest in, going all the way, but really to raise their profile. And then the other thing is to really be if you will, a player in the party politics nationally. And that's, trying to gobble up some delegates because it's a whole new delegate process this time, remember also, right? So trying to gather some delegates together that they can horse trade into importance, or at least having a say-so. And so I think for de Blasio, it's a combination of those things. We don't really need to raise his profile that much. He's mayor of New York, and that's a huge stage and a national stage on its own. But I think a number of things are sort of being a player and a decision maker in the party and the party's future, highlighting some issues. He's talking about working class families. I think it's more of also talking about trying to govern and manage urban cities in this new age. And then there's also the thing that a lot of people want to do is sort of, play against Trump, right? So that whoever is the nominee, or whoever is in the top tier of being the nominee doesn't have to, do that, get in the mud with Trump on a daily basis.
I think Eljoy hit on a lot of important points. Some are, he's term limited. He needs a next career option. Mm-hmm. And if you have a field where someone who represents a city that's smaller than a city council district, running for president and contributing his ideas, why not the mayor of the largest city in America who has, ideas and policies that have been successfully implemented across the city in that mix as well. So I think there's a significant part of it. We also know that de Blasio has wanted to be part of the national conversation for a very long time. He tried in 2016 with his progressive agenda, this coalition of folks that were going to try and move the conversation within the Democratic Party to the left. That was an organization that didn't quite get off the ground and came before Senator Bernie Sanders got into the race and really shifted the conversation in that direction. So I think we've got some lingering desire from 4 years ago, and someone who needs to figure out what his next move is.
You've heard the mayor when we were in Iowa, South Carolina, literally talking about the idea that no one ever thought Donald Trump would be president. And that if Donald Trump could be president, certainly an executive of a $92 billion corporation, which is what the city is, could possibly be president of the United States. So again, it goes back to why not, first of all. Second of all, he has nothing to lose in the city. He feels like he's done major accomplishments that could bring urban issues to the national stage. And his strategy is to find that common ground between urban America, people in rural America, issues that he's kind of characterizing under the banner of sort of working people. So I think, he has something to bring to this debate among the candidates. candidates. I mean, if you look at the candidates, you could argue that he has more accomplishments than, say, Beto O'Rourke, for example, and that he has issues that are important to America right now.
Is that true that he has nothing to lose? I mean, in some sense, I definitely understand where you're coming from. In another sense, I feel like, at least to a little bit of an extent, he's really risking his reputation among New Yorkers. There's a group that have already written him off and said he's not a good mayor, he doesn't care enough about his job. But then there's a pretty big group who are either sort of in the middle, unsure about him, or kind of like him. And I feel like he's risking, with that pool of New Yorkers, moving them into that other category of thinking that he doesn't care enough about his job.
Well, are you talking about legacy, about sort of like the average? But okay, so how hard are New Yorkers on mayors in general, right? So there's the combination of, we may love them for a bit, and while they're in office, we hated them once we have foresight and sort of look at how they bungled things or didn't get my trash picked up correctly, and things like that. So we're a hard bunch on mayors in general. So in terms of just thinking about his legacy as just that, of sort of losing other New Yorkers, that's going to happen regardless. Like, regardless, there's going to be some stories afterwards about the top 10 reasons why de Blasio was not a good mayor, and then there's going to be the top 10 reasons why he was. And I'm sure there are a lot of parents from 3K to pre-K and sort of all of those things that could talk more about that. So I kind of agree that the nothing to lose, it's not like he's going to not raise any money. It's not like he's not going to try to campaign hard. And look, I worked with him directly. That's the beginning of our relationship when we were both delegates for John Edwards. If he's the same kind of hardworking person as he was then, which I believe he is at least going to give it as much as he can. So I don't think it's going to be a situation where he's worrying too much about the books that'll be written about him as mayor.
I think on that front, though, he's got a chance in the last 2 years or so to, not necessarily in the sort of day-to-day muck of people are frustrated with him and frustrated with the city and traffic and trash and all these things, but then, you get a little time out of office and maybe people look back on him a little more kindly. And I think a run like this, if it doesn't go anywhere and he's persistent about it, could sort of influence that way that people think back to him about his legacy.
I mean, I think his legacy is really already set. His legacy is going to be universal pre-kindergarten. That's just what it is. It's a major accomplishment. It's something that he was in South Carolina this weekend talking about that. They don't have that there. I talked to parents that were like, we had to spend $10,000 for our 4-year-old to go to school, and they were really feeling him talking about universal pre-kindergarten. So his legacy is already set. I'm not sure there's anything he's going to do in his last 2 years that's going to top universal pre-kindergarten.
And we should say both of you, Brigid and Jeff, you were with him in Iowa and South Carolina, the first stops on his presidential campaign. So that's part of the reason we're happy to have you here. Go ahead, Brigid. Sorry.
I mean, the thing that was most striking to me when we were in Iowa and South Carolina was, people have often talked about how the mayor is, a really acute strategist, and he has an ability to understand what people are thinking and feeling on the ground and to connect with that. And his message of this presidential campaign, working people first, is all framed around this notion that people are working harder and getting back less. And the programs that he talks about out of New York City really bolster that kind of message. He can say, I know you're working really hard. In New York City, we instituted universal pre-K. We're trying to lift that burden off parents and help save you X number of dollars so that your child's getting a great education and you can do your job. What was interesting was listening to, farmers in Churton, Iowa, talk about what makes their life hard, how difficult it is to sustain their family farms. And it was all about the economic squeeze. These big agricultural companies coming in, buying up land, real estate, and making it hard for them to afford to keep running their farms.
Not about their child being in pre-K or not.
But it connects, right? Because it's this idea of, I'm working as hard as I can, and I can't make ends meet. You go to South Carolina, you hear the exact same thing when people come out of a meeting with him where they're talking about affordable housing and this low-income housing development. This idea that people are just, that squeeze. Now, it's similar message to what a Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are also talking about. But, to his credit, he knows that that is where people are at, and he's connecting with them. And what he's connecting on is this idea that Donald Trump was trying to tell you that your life was hard and that the government wasn't doing enough, and he was selling himself as someone who was for working people. Well, he was a con artist, and I'm going to tell you what you really deserve. And so I was struck by how similar what people were describing as their burdens in both Iowa and South Carolina was, and how he was connecting with people over it.
Yeah, people's lives are hard, right, around the country, and a lot of people want relief in a variety of ways where the government can help put something in place there, remove a burden there, and he's trying to talk to them about that.
And that brings me to the connection and talking to, as all of the candidates and campaigns are going out and talking to voters and sort of know what that squeeze is. That's what's going to make the difference on who's actually going to come out in these primaries and who the electorate will be, right? Because is it going to be the traditional caucus and primary folks, right? Or are people disinfecting and thinking that Trump promised one thing and he didn't do anything? All of these Democratic candidates are promising things, right? So is it better for me to stay home? Something's going to happen regardless, but nothing is really going to change our life? Or are people going to be motivated by each of these campaigns to come out and sort of make a decision on who has the best strategy going forward? And that we don't know now. That we're not going to know until February,
so how about
right?
this?
Like
so
a couple
folks,
of weeks before, in terms of, okay, who are the people that have been mobilized and energized by those folks? Because if you fast forward to what Barack Obama was able to do, right? Like even in those early states, to pull out people who had never caucus before, because they understood, you talk about de Blasio as a strategist, right? He understood that he needed to pull more people out, people who had never been involved in the process before, in order to overcome, because he wouldn't overcome with the traditional caucus goer or the traditional primary voter. So here's the question now for each of these campaigns, and particularly for de Blasio. Is he inspiring enough? Does he have a prescription enough that compels the farmer, that compels somebody from public housing in South Carolina to come out and say, yes, this is the person that I believe has the best prescription for my ills?
Well, just two things. I mean, if you think about his message, which is going to be that he's progressive, but he's also an executive.
Yeah.
So while Bernie Sanders has proposed some ideas and Elizabeth Warren have proposed ideas, he's actually implemented some of the stuff in New York City. So that's going to be his argument that, hey, I know what you're going through, first of all. Second of all, I've created program solutions for 8 million people in New York City for some of these difficult issues. Secondly, I think there's a bit of regret on the mayor's end, because if you think back to 2014, he was kind of seen as the tip of this like progressive spear, right? I mean, I think people forget that. It's been 5 years now, but you forget that he was on the cover of magazines. Right. And the question was, is this the start of a new progressive wave? Now, he's made some political missteps that I think he's wasted a lot of that political capital that he had back in 2014. But if you're him and you're sitting and you're seeing Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders talk about being progressive, and some of these issues are now coming forward that you were talking about 5 years ago, you have to think that, hey, I could be a messenger for these issues.
So I totally agree. And I think the message part, I think he's pretty comfortable in. The challenge, I think, for him is the organization. And, we asked him, how do you see this moving forward? And he described, this sort of patient, listening, grassroots campaign. Sounded a lot like a mayoral campaign. And I'm not confident that a model like that translates nationally. And then that links to your first question about what is the risk to him here in the city. To actually do that kind of patient, listening, grassroots campaign means being out of New York City all the time. And we already know he's got another trip lined up. And there will become, I think, a certain fatigue among New Yorkers. Where's the mayor now? Kind of a where's Waldo?
There's been a little bit of that already, though. There's been a little of that already, which is interesting. I wrote this in something that, people, some of the reaction to this was sort of like, well, he's already out of town all the time anyway, so he may as well run for president. But let me just set the calendar for a second for folks. We're talking in May 2019. Right. There are no votes cast in this presidential primary, as you said, until February 2020. Right. So even though he's late into the race compared to all these other candidates, there's quite a bit of time here. So I think he's banking on the idea that slow and steady, he can sort of move up from 1% in some polls, if he registers at all, to 2, 3, 4, And people start to say, oh, the mayor of the biggest city in the country is actually doing this, and he's, appealing to some people, and there's a rationale, I think, there for him to, I've got 9 months till I need to show something in Iowa that then gets me to New Hampshire. And then I need to show something that gets me to South Carolina. And then, hey, maybe 6, 7, 8 of these people have dropped out and I'm in the mix somewhere.
Yeah, and I think, that's a calculation for a lot of the campaigns. Elizabeth Warren has the same thing, right? And I think this rush to conversation is, not you specifically, but a media hype, right? Because we have to keep the conversation, keep the 2020 conversation in play, right? So we need to talk about the polls, and we need to talk about so we need we need to do that. But I think the sort of one, you don't want to burn out from money, you don't want to burn out any staff that you have, and so having a slow strategic plan in terms of, and with clear benchmarks on what he will determine internally are wins, right? Because like I mentioned, the vote is not till February, but what is the internal win for the campaign? Is it getting on the debate stage? Is it, ticking up in the polls, even if it's slowly? Is it additional campaign staff? Sort of what are the internal wins that you're able to chart and then convince other donors and then potential voters that this is the race and the slow, methodical plan that I had all along?
Yeah, and I think the way you described him campaigning is really the only option he has, because we talked about the Quinnipiac poll where 48% of people said, or voters didn't know enough about him. So that's actually good news if I'm Bill de Blasio, because that means that I can go out to Iowa and I can talk to farmers more. I can go to Nevada. I can, try to lock in a Latino base. I can go to South Carolina. I can bring Shirlane McCray, his African-American wife, with him down to South Carolina, and I can try to make a connection with Black voters. So, that is some good news on his end, and who knows what's going to happen in February. All kinds of things happen. Candidates drop out, people lose money, scandals.
To Aljo's point, we don't know who's going to vote, but we do expect a huge voter turnout, which could include a lot of people who haven't necessarily been regularly voting. And what we saw from 2016 to 2018, in 2020, we're going to very likely see another huge jump. And
just think about who wasn't eligible to vote or who was too young and not eligible to vote, and thinking about, will that population sort of be greater and have greater influence going into this election cycle as well?
And we don't need to dissect this now, but a couple of the big questions are on the table are, does the Joe Biden sort of number come down, and then where on this sort of progressive wing of the party, the Bernie Sanders, the Elizabeth Warren, we can generously put Bill de Blasio in there even though he's barely registering 1% in the polls. How does that sort itself out? Does anybody then take off? Are they all fighting for the same section of the Democratic electorate? Those are some of the tricky things. But I wanted to come back to his ability to move ahead in this race in terms of actually running a campaign. How is he going to do it? How is he going to raise the money to compete? And should we be very concerned? Should New Yorkers be very concerned about the fact that he's very likely going to be raising money from people who aren't necessarily excited about him running for president, but they want favorable treatment from New York City Hall?
Yeah, I think that's where the accountability is going to have to come in, and looking at those campaign finance reports very carefully. This is going to be his base of money. Actually, lots of candidates come to New York for money, of course, because this is where the money's at, but especially him. So he's going to find people that want to donate. There've already been developers who want to get into the New York City market who've held fundraisers for him. So it's going to be interesting. He's going to have to walk a very fine line. He's going to have to make sure that, no special favors are being done or being given out, because that becomes a vulnerability for him. If he does make it to a debate stage, then that becomes an issue of who are your fundraisers and why do they want to see you on stage?
I spent some time looking at donors to his Fairness PAC and trying to figure out, who some of these people were they still aligned with him going forward? And there were a couple interesting things that I found in doing that. There were some big Democratic donors, national Democratic donors, that had given to the Fairness PAC, not a huge amount of money. Will he be able to keep some of those folks? there are some of those people who have already aligned with other candidates. I talked to one donor who, was just completely frank about how now that Biden's in, he's a Biden guy. And so that's going to be a challenge for the mayor. There are also some people that are, head scratchers on that list, big Republican donors who, are out of Florida and other places that make you think, I wonder what the calculation here was. And so I think, to Jeff's point, we're going to see a lot of interesting stuff in that first campaign finance filing.
In July, I believe.
Yeah.
And that'll give us a sense of not only all of those issues, but also a little bit of, does he have any grassroots support? Are there 10,000 New Yorkers who support him for mayor who give him $1, $5, $10,
Yeah. I think also that is going to be less of the legacy issue. I think that him being absent, and God forbid something happens in the city, and two, sort of where his money is coming from are going to be the two biggest headaches for him during this race. One, you mentioned jokingly, people think he's absent all the time, whereas in my case, I see him everywhere. So
Okay.
it's like, why are you here? So I think him being absent.
Brooklyn political functions, or what?
I feel like he does have a larger, like a presence in the city, all the time. But it also could be, I'm a strategist, right? So I'm in a lot more other places. But I think him being absent, and every time he's absent, that's going to pile onto the list, and every headline is going to say the absent mayor, or where is he now, or things like that. And then as you guys start writing about post-July, where his money comes from, and sort of making connections and things from there, that's going to be his biggest headaches, right? And then there's also the headache of, because of those two things, how the relationship with the state and with the governor continues to be at friction as the city is, asking for, trying to push for other things. Let's think about getting to a budget season a month before, getting through a state budget season, or another legislative cycle where they will also be it'll be election year for the state legislature, and the caucuses and primaries coming up.
The one thing that I think that we've talked a little bit about it, but I think is probably one of the mayor's greatest advantages and liabilities is all of us. I mean, there are very few other candidates who have a press corps that follow them, wherever they go. Certainly there are national reporters that cover the candidates, but this is someone who's running who can have a meeting with 7 people in Iowa, and yet millions of people are going to know exactly what happened because he has people who are following it. And for better or for worse, I mean, I think it was, earlier this week on The Daily Show, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand was the guest, but there was this video about, de Blasio, the groundhog killer, that was talking about his run for president. It was very funny. And in some ways, it was the more viral thing coming out of that. And when you're trying to just get name recognition out there, I mean,
all press is good press.
All press is good press.
We're in the media capital.
You don't want to be mocked all the time, but all press is good press.
We're in the media capital of the world. He was on CNN the other day.
Yeah.
He did his announcement on GMA.
Right.
That didn't require, a studio shoot. He rolled down and walked into the studio and was speaking to millions of people.
Right. He'll be very available to all those bookers. I was just going to add, in terms of some of the things as New Yorkers balance and try to make sense of what to make of their mayor actually running for president. There's a city budget due July 1st. Yep. As you say, there's an ongoing state legislative session till the end of June, depending on exactly when they wrap it up. So there's a lot of business to take care of. What should folks know about sort of that landscape and who's running the city when the mayor is out of town? He designates the first deputy mayor. How does that work? Did you observe on the campaign trail? Did you get a sense that he's checking in constantly with the first deputy mayor?
Well, I wasn't with him when he was making the call. But, Dean Fullahan is a very respected, administrator. And he also has Emma Wolf, his chief of staff, who's also pretty well respected. So, the argument that he can be on the road, make calls, and still be in touch is interesting one. I'm not sure when it comes down to the nitty gritty of, those final days in Albany and, you need to be in person or you need to go meet with the speaker to get something. So I think that's where he's going to suffer. The question comes if there are major things that the city needs and doesn't get, then he's going to be open to that criticism of being an absentee mayor.
I mean, I think the end of this legislative session is a little different. For so many years we've been like, mayoral control has been this issue that has been haunting the mayor. That's not an issue this year. Certainly rent laws of schools. Certainly rent laws is an issue that is of big concern and could come back to bite this mayor depending on what the outcome is. But I think it's also interesting to think about in this term how he restructured his deputy mayors. You have First Deputy Mayor Dean Foulahan, who is, sort of person who's in charge, but then you also have Deputy Mayor Laura Anglin, who's in charge of operations. So you have this other person who can be responsible for the day-to-day, running of the city, the running of the sanitation department, the running of, the schools in a way that's different than what we had during his first term.
He added that position for the second term. And Dean Foulahan, we should note, as it's budget season, was his budget director before becoming first deputy mayor. So as he needs to negotiate this budget with the city council, he does have not only the person who, when he's out of town running the city, is his first deputy mayor, but is also his former budget director, working with his current budget director and trying to hash things out with the city council. I'm certainly watching for, as he makes visits to other places, is it clear that local press in those places is taking him seriously and amplifying him? He might have New York press following him that gets his, his travel picked up back home, but how much is the press in these places he's going to paying attention to him and getting, his appearances amplified across whatever city, state he may be in? Go ahead, right down the road here.
I'm looking to see if he makes the debate stage.
End of June debate.
Yeah, so if he makes the debate stage, I mean, for a lot of the candidates, that's a place where they need to show up to show that they have some real fight in this game, and you'll start to see people fall away if they, how they perform there.
From a purely political standpoint, I agree with Eldroy. If he makes the debate, it's a huge boost for this campaign. If he doesn't make the debate, I don't think it kills it, but it makes things much harder. It makes this like underdog status sort of solidified.
They have 20 spots. We just say over 2 nights they're holding their first 2 debates are both 2-nighters, 20 spots. He's got to make one of the 20 spots.
Yeah, I think we need to look at the money and see, where that money is coming from. How much is he going to be able to raise? The one thing I point out to people is that, we're in a bit of a bubble here in New York City. And, when he goes outside of the city, there's not that intense focus on these very specific issues that we all deal with here. And we saw that this weekend. There were several local media outlets that were there and asking him questions throughout the trip.
People are going to be focused on what's his message about his campaign, what are his promises if he's president. It's probably not going to travel much, at least early on, that he's got a homelessness crisis, a public housing crisis. Some of the things we didn't get into here, but people in New York well know are the major things that he still needs to try to fix as mayor. If he makes some hay, we may see a little more attention on that, but we'll get to that. Thank you all very much for being here, and thank you for watching this special edition of Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. I'm Ben Max. Goodbye.